Well, welcome back. I am so excited that you've come back for week 2. I also need you to know I'm really serious about each of these letters speaking to our church. Last week, we had an incredible time talking about the church at Ephesus. And today now we're going to move on to another church, and it's the church at Smyrna. Through the Apostle John, Jesus wrote 7 letters to 7 ancient churches. Last week, we looked at the first letter written to the church in Ephesus. You'll remember they had lost their first love, and Jesus was encouraging them to refan the flames of their passion for him. This week, we're studying the church letter written to the church in Smyrna. Passion and love for Christ was not an issue for this body of believers, and because of that, they were facing a completely different challenge. Here's what it was: persecution and suffering. Smyrna was a beautiful city. In fact, it is referred to as the crown of Asia and was the center of trade, science, medicine, and art. It was home to a massive stadium for the Olympic Games. This city was an incredible place to be, but it was also very worldly. The name Smyrna means sweet smelling or myrrh. Myrrh was a perfume, an anointment for the dead. Because of that, myrrh was also a symbol of suffering. And today, we remember Smyrna as the suffering church or the persecuted church. Just as myrrh was used to anoint Jesus' body after his gruesome death, the church in Smyrna was crushed by Roman persecution. But through that persecution, the church gave off a fragrant perfume. Jesus warned us that the unbelieving world would also hate his followers, remember? Because it hated him first. When your allegiance lies with Christ and you don't align yourself with the values of the world will not accept you. Jesus said, "Remember what I taught you, that a servant isn't superior to his master? And since they persecuted me, guess what? They will also persecute you." Jesus writes to the church at Smyrna, "I know about your suffering and your poverty, but you are rich. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. If you remain faithful, even when facing death, I will give you the crown of life." Does this remind you of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount? He said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the persecuted. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven." In all this, Jesus isn't just warning us that persecution is a way of life for the believers, but that we are to expect and to remain faithful and filled with joy in the persecution. We can see this testimony in the life of Polycarp, who was a leader in the Smyrna church. He was martyred in 160 AD when he refused to worship Caesar as God or renounce Christ. We know from historical records that even as he was dragged into the arena to be burned alive, Polycarp prayed, "I give you thanks that you count me worthy to be numbered among your martyrs, sharing the cup of Christ and the resurrection to eternal life. May I be received this day as an acceptable sacrifice, as you, the true God, have predestined, revealed to me, and now fulfilled." The Christians of Smyrna were hated, slandered by the Jews, hunted, and poor in the eyes of the world. Jesus understood the suffering they endured in his name, and so he commends them and encourages their faith. But he also warns that more persecution is to come. Remember when I said earlier that Smyrna was a famous host of the Olympic Games? Jesus references that at the end of his letter. Victorious athletes received the crown of a victor's wreath, but Jesus writes, "If you remain faithful, even when you're facing death, I will give you the crown of life." What an awesome prize that eternal life is. In some ways, the church of Smyrna is not much different than Central Community Church. We are on fire for Christ, right? Sharing his love and good news in Wichita and around the world. And I believe that God has even greater things planned for us. And because of that, Satan is looking for a way to cause us to stumble, to discourage us in our work, to break our unity with one another. We have to be ready to stand firm in our faith for whatever persecution or suffering might be heading our way. And when that time comes, either as a church or in our individual lives, should we be surprised? Absolutely not. And is it okay to cry out in pain or mourn? Absolutely. But it is important that we come up higher and ask God to show us from His viewpoint. Like Polycarp, we can celebrate in our suffering because it means God is very much working in and through us. Romans 8:28 reminds us, and we know with great confidence that God, who is deeply concerned about us, causes all things to work together as a plan for good for those who love God, to those who are called according to His plan and purpose. God has a kingdom view. He values our eternal life more than the few short years we live on this earth. And He sees the maturity we gain through suffering. We look more like Jesus as we surrender, trusting in God's plan and experiencing God's power to endure. Can you look back in your life to a time of suffering that God eventually worked for your good and His glory? As you share in your group, consider times of suffering you have gone through and how God brought you out of it. How were you transformed through it? How do the testimonies of other sufferers impact your walk with God? Oh, may God bless your time together as you learn more about God's goodness and His work in our lives and the life of Central Community Church. We'll see you next week.